We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Paul from the Sirius Report. He was originally a physicist, and he was awarded a PhD in biomolecular physics, after which he spent some time working in academia. He then went on to work in the financial sector and worked in some major banks until the financial crisis of 2008, when he left the banking sector to work in the precious metal sector. Welcome back, Paul. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's a pleasure. I couldn't believe how long it is since when we did the first show. It's time flies, but I mean, also a bit of it's been me endlessly having to put off us doing this. So I'm glad we finally managed to do it.
Absolutely. And, I'm always happy to be flexible with my schedule to make sure that we get, some of these really important conversations, recorded. And I'm happy that you're joining me again here. And I think we're going to have, there's so many ideas that you really take the time to understand. So I think we're going to have an excellent discussion here today. But
well, thank you.
Maybe starting with an idea that we've spoken about many times on the show, and that's the idea of unintended consequences. So how do you think this idea maybe applies to the situation for the West when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine? Has this really served as a catalyst in a lot of ways to give rise to a much more multipolar world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, on steroids, in an abundance we should not have seen. And what I would say is, on the day the war started, talk about don't want to go too much in the past, but I made a point and a comment on Twitter that if the West pushed ahead with all the idea that we're going to throw the kitchen sink at Russia with regards to sanctions, I said the West will collapse because it's completely unsustainable. And the law of unintended consequences could not have applied more than with respect to the war. And we're not talking here about the politics of war. We're just talking about the consequences, obviously, of how this war's unfolded from a West's perspective. And it's manifested itself in so many ways. So let's just go back to February the 24th. And the West very clearly thought, okay, Russia's the aggressor. It's invaded Ukraine. Special military operation doesn't matter. It's a war. For me, it's always been a war. So they effectively went to war in Ukraine. And their attitude was, right, okay, we're going to have to do something about this. So their perception was, we can go in and apply maximum sanctions without actually thinking of any of the consequences. Well, what happens if our perspective on these sanctions fails to materialize? And principally, they did it for the following reasons. They said, well, if we put maximum pressure with sanctions, and given that Russia's invaded a country in Europe and started a war, A, we can crush their economy. B, we'll crush their financial system and the ruble. We'll isolate them on a world stage to the point that nobody will trade with them anymore. And even actually bizarrely thought that would apply to China as well. That shows the level of ignorance that exists in the West, because I've said this for many years, China and Russia joined at the hip. They work everywhere internationally together. If one's in one nation, the other one's in from a multipolar world perspective, and they work tirelessly to support each other. So there's one major miscalculation. And the other thing, of course, is they feel will cause massive civil unrest in Russia because people will be so angry that effectively the country is being starved almost into submission. And therefore Putin will be gone. And their perception was this all happened in 2 or 3 weeks. And then, of course, after 2 and 3 weeks, it didn't happen. And obviously, over the next 9 months or so, we've seen how things have unfolded. And they misjudged the sentiment of the global South because, unfortunately, the West's perception is the global South doesn't exist. I mean, the West idea is we're the primary nations in the world. We're the movers and shakers. We're the ones who make everything happen. Well, you're just a bunch of nobodies who has no relevance, not, of course, understanding that multipolarity was slowly just gathering momentum anyway. And of course, the consequence of that is the global south rallied around Russia and went, okay, we'll help you. The Indians said, we'll buy a huge amount of oil off you because it's beneficial to us. We get it a lot cheaper. Energy is the lifeblood of a nation. So if our energy costs are less, then our production costs are less. We produce price inflation, et cetera, and it helps to stabilize our economy as a result of it because we manufacture a lot of goods. And also, we're very energy dependent. So their perception is, like the global south, you're a reliable partner, Russia, you'll provide oil and gas, and we won't have a problem with this, or in their case, oil. So that was one thing. The other thing is they hadn't understood the West. And this is public knowledge. I mean, I've discussed it since the Maidan in 2014, and other people have. Russia was rotating its economy. It had import substitution. So it was beginning to say, okay, we don't necessarily have to depend on the West. For these imports, we can, construct domestic markets for a whole raft of things, not just agriculture, industrial tools, etc. Okay, they didn't do everything in those, 8 years or so till the war started, but they made a lot of progress. So they misunderstood how the Russian economy works. They also misunderstood how Russia was preparing for kind of being removed from SWIFT. But we'll come to the SWIFT point in a minute because that's absolutely critical in terms of misunderstanding what their policies were going to cause as a consequence of implementing.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, just before we continue here, maybe let's just make it explicit where the global south is kind of, and the countries that includes for those that might understand that term.
That's a great question. Well, obviously the global south is pretty much anybody except North America, maybe parts of Central, maybe you might include Mexico in that. Also, of course, Europe. I include the United Kingdom in that. You can include South Korea, Japan, probably Australia, and New Zealand. Pretty much the rest of the world is the global south. I mean, okay, and within Europe, of course, we include Turkey, just in case anybody whose geography isn't that great. So basically the rest of the world. So South America, Central America, Africa, Asia. Obviously, Russia is part of the global south, and obviously China. So effectively, 87% of the world's population is in the global south. So the West is in this small minority in that sense. And maybe we can talk a bit more about how the West underestimated the global south shortly. But yeah, no, it's a very important question because people often hear that said and don't grasp what it actually means.
Mm-hmm. As you say, it's 87% of the world's population. It really matters.
Yes, it didn't matter to the West because they don't think it's relevant, because they still think the rest of the world is kind of living in some bubble in the 1950s or 60s. It's like a lot of people in the West think Russia is the way it was in the 80s, and so is China. And they've got no concept that those nations are nothing like that whatsoever. So going back to the issue financially, they thought we can destroy the ruble, which of course they failed to do. They also underestimated the fact that, and this is getting into the politics too much of the war, but the Ukraine war didn't start really in February the 24th, 2022. It started after the Maidan, and there was a kind of quasi-civil war between so-called Russian separatists in Donbass and Ukrainian forces on the other side, and there was a contact line, and this war had been simmering on and off since 2014. So there's a whole backstory, which I know a lot of people understand, but other people don't. And of course, from the Russian people's perspective, they're feeling, and again, we're talking about how they feel about this. It's not about whether anyone in the West agrees with it. They totally supported Putin going into Ukraine for the reasons that the Russians said we're going into to start this war. And we can say what those reasons are, because from their perspective, they thought what was going to happen is that there was going to be an escalation from the Ukrainian side to try and effectively wipe out all the the ethnic Russians in Donbass. Now, that's a controversial statement, but I'm just stating the fact. That's the perception. So it doesn't matter whether we agree or disagree with that, but that galvanized the Russian people, whose attitude was, we support Putin in this war. And his popularity has never been higher. So again, that was an absolutely spectacularly bad miscalculation on the part of the West. And perhaps the biggest mistake the West could ever have made was the issue of excluding Russian banks from SWIFT had been doing the kind of round since 2014, not all the time, on and off. I talked about it in the past. And I made the statement in the past that, yes, they could do this, but it would be a very foolish thing to do. And of course, consequently, they decided to do that. But the biggest mistake they made was sanctioning the Russian central bank. And it's open to debate how much Forex reserves they stole in the West, effectively. Some people saying it's 300 billion. I don't think it's that high. I think the Europeans kind of said they've got 40 billion. But anyway, it's a significant amount of money. And effectively, they froze it and stole it. Now, this might have all looked great from the optics in the West, going, we're being tough on Russia and we're going to crush them by seizing and freezing their assets effectively. The global South's looking at this going, hang on a minute. Right, if we upset the United States, are we next? Could we be the one who has our banks cut off from SWIFT? Could we have our central bank effectively frozen out to SWIFT? Will they steal our assets, our Forex reserves? And that set alarm bells off all over the global South. And where we'd seen the development of relations between the Saudis and the Russians through OPEC Plus and other developments, and the Saudis and the Chinese from energy and China investing in Saudi Arabia on energy projects and on this kind of 2030 vision project that MBS has in Saudi Arabia. They were already ongoing, but this accelerated the process of multipolarity and de-dollarization because Saudis going, well, we don't trust the United States. We could be next. And so were other Middle Eastern nations, and so were nations in the global South. So they actually saw this as, well, we're not going to take sides, and we're not going to be forced to take sides. And in fact, privately, we're kind of quite sympathetic with what Russia's doing. So we're going to keep trading with them. And we're going to find ways to evade the issue of payments made through SWIFT. So the only way you can do that is to de-dollarize. So ironically, in the process of trying to wage this war in Russia, for all the reasons we've stated, they ironically also contributed to the ongoing demise of the dollar. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there who go, the dollar's going to be around for 30 years. This is nonsense. Well, it's kind of a process almost akin to a death by 1,000 cuts. It's not. One particular development changes everything. But if you have increasingly nations like the Russians and the Chinese, $200 billion equivalent of trade between them, all in non-dollar terms, and then you have the Saudis potentially in a matter of weeks. This is open to debate, but I know in a very small sense, they already trade in the petro yuan effectively now. Are they going to make some big announcement? Maybe, maybe not, which will be a huge groundbreaking change in terms of how energy is bought and sold, particularly obviously in the Middle East, because I don't think if Saudi does it, the other nations will likewise might join in deciding to trade in currency other than the dollar. So it's just this cumulative effect. And then you've got nations like India going, well, we're trading with Russia either in rupees or rubles. And by the way, we're in discussions with countless other nations in the global South how we can trade in local currencies. Now, of course, people are sat there going, this is impossible. They can't do this. It can't work. But here's why it does work. Because here's the fundamental problem. Well, we saw, and I dispute this big rally in the dollar we've seen in recent months. I don't regard that as being a natural kind of evolutionary process, all to do with, look, the US is raising interest rates, because when the Europeans started to raise interest rates, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, didn't make any difference to those currencies. But here's the problem the US experienced. Because what was happening, as we all know, the dollar was strengthening against not every country, but practically every currency. So all these countries are going, hang on, we need to take our local currency and exchange it into dollars, but our currency is getting hammered. So actually, we don't really want to trade in dollars anymore. Is there a way we can circumvent that problem? And, the rupee got hammered against the dollar. So they were going, this is great. We don't need to trade in the dollar with the Russians. We can work out an arrangement. And you know what? It lessened a lot of the inflationary problems they were suffering because of this massive depreciation of their currency. So other nations are looking at this going, hang on, maybe we can do this. Okay, we can't trade with Western nations in local currencies, but we can do it with each other, and it helps to smooth out some of the fundamental problems we had with our currency getting massively depreciated against the dollar. And we saw this when they were obviously trying to defend the yen to some degree, and there was obviously huge amounts of US Treasuries being dumped in the process of trying to defend the yen to some degree. But there was a bigger consequence of that, where it wasn't just the Japanese doing it. People were saying the Chinese were doing it to defend the currency. They weren't. The Chinese were doing it because they were going, hang on, you've got a problem with Russia and Ukraine, and you're trying to drive us into war with Taiwan. Maybe you'll cut us off. So maybe we need to start massively dumping treasuries in the process. But there was different reasons. Now, the one thing the US is very mindful of is it doesn't want the whole world dumping enormous amounts of treasuries for whatever reason, because that creates huge amounts of instability, as we know, in the treasury markets, which they're desperate to avoid. So it's interesting, even though everyone's trying to tie it to interest rate movements, we sort of saw, I'm not a big fan of the dollar index. I think, frankly, it's a bit of a waste of time. It's just something that, doesn't really focus on the reality of the dollar from my perspective. But it rose to about 114, and then it was back at 105 the other day. I think it's gone up slightly, but I think this was a realization, hang on, this is getting too strong, and we're going to start having serious structural problems in the treasury markets, because countries going to start dumping because they're obviously, their currency is too weak. So they're going to have problems in a sort of balance of payments. So what are we going to do? We're going to have to find a way to get around this problem. So either, if we have to pay in dollars, what are we going to do? Then we're going to have to dump some of our reserves and to pay for this.
And we saw a good example of that when Japan started dumping some treasuries in order to support their bond market, right? And that kind of serves two purposes, does it not?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And that was a great example. And it's not really that interesting to talk about the spectacular failure of monetary policy in, obviously, Japan, and why they're desperately trying to defend the bond markets. But yeah, of course, absolutely. They were dumping huge amounts of treasuries so then they could buy yen to try and support the currency. And, these are all, again, the sort of law of unintended consequences, because here's the thing, if you're going to go to war with Russia, effectively, there's a proxy war being fought by NATO, everyone knows that, but I'm talking about you're going to go to war with them economically, financially, and geopolitically. You need to carefully think through, what are we doing and why are we doing this? And we may be all full of bravado on the surface and go, we're going to win this war in a matter of weeks because Russia will collapse. But someone should have been saying, well, if it doesn't happen, what's the consequences? And I think this is a good point where we can now start to go, okay, so we had the boomerang effect with sanctions and how it's blown up in the West space. And again, that was because no one went, well, and here's just one fundamental point. How's Europe thrived, in inverted commas, and relative to where we are now? Is because it's relied on cheap Russian energy. Germany would never have been the industrial sort of heartland of Europe, for want of a better word, without cheap Russian energy. And the irony about all this is that last year they could have signed long-term agreements to buy Russian energy compared to today's prices dirt cheap. They're literally giving in comparison, which would have given them long-term energy security and gone a long way to stopping the sort of deindustrialization and the gutting of Germany in this sense. And again, this is because it's ideological hatred. We don't trust you. Well, what don't you trust about Russia? Well, if they always provided you energy, yes. Have they always honored their contract? Yes. Have they ever defaulted? Never. So why are you so wary of signing a long-term contract? Because, of course, this comes from partly this brainwashing that the US has gone, you can't trust Russia, you can't trust China. You need to decouple from. You're too dependent on for energy or finished goods or whatever, other commodities. And you need to find alternative markets. Now, okay, there's some argument and validity to that. Even though despite Russia being very reliable for energy, you might argue, well, you might want to find alternatives. But the one thing you don't do is sit there and effectively declare war as a proxy and declare war on them economically, financially, knowing that you're dependent on that cheap energy, and you decide to make these knee-jerk decisions as a war's ongoing. If you're going to make those policy decisions, you should have said 5 years ago, okay, we might want to change the mix of our energy. We might want to change how we trade with China, for example. We might want to look at alternative markets because just to diversify some of the risk, for argument's sake. And that's perfectly reasonable to have that attitude. But you have a long-term plan. And you might gradually wean yourself off energy from Russia, but you don't just go, I know, I've got an idea. I'm just going to set an arbitrary date and we're going to cut off the supply of Russian gas and Russian oil. And we're going to find these markets somewhere else. And I made the point before we came on. It's literally, well, I'm sure there's a supermarket somewhere that there's 10 million barrels of oil on the shelf somewhere. And I can just go along to this supermarket and buy the oil and they'll just deliver it in 24 hours. And well, no, that's not how the world operates. And bear in mind, if you're not going to take Russian energy, and Germany has 55 billion cubic meters through what was Nord Stream 1 annually, how are you going to replace that? And yeah, the Americans made some promises. And this is, again, we'll come to the American side of this, where that is starting to blow up in the US's face as well. But they didn't think of this. They just went, well, as these other countries produce LNG, they'll give us the shortfall. And they're all going, hang on. No, we can't, because we have to honor our existing agreements with our customers. And B, hang on a minute, we're not sure we really want to have any major deals with you because, the US may sanction us in the future and you're going to walk away from the energy deal with us. And you can't exactly crawl on our hands and knees back to our old customers who we kind of shafted in the process and go, well, do you want to take up the relationship again with us? Because they're going to go, no, because I don't trust you either. So there was no thought given. I mean, it's almost like a comedy of errors, but with catastrophic consequences or potentially catastrophic consequences. So here's Germany, and Germany's a great example. It's the heart of Europe, really, it's kind of the economic, financial powerhouse, so to speak, and from an industrial perspective. And Germany was kind of forced for a long time into not signing off on Nord Stream 2. I mean, Merkel, ironically, if Merkel had stayed chancellor, the Ukraine war probably would never have happened. And she wanted it because she said, we need energy security. So they kind of stalled it. And then, of course, the Ukraine war started and they went, right, we're sanctioning Nord Stream 2. So you're not getting another 55 billion cubic meters of gas. And okay, subsequently, and we're not going to get into the discussion who sabotaged Nord Stream 1 and 2. I mean, I think anybody who really assesses it objectively knows who's responsible, more or less. But the point is, that then meant, well, Germany can never actually, at the moment, because it could take 6 months a year to repair the two pipelines for Nord Stream 1. One of them's still functional in Nord Stream 2, and the other one isn't. But of course, you have to have cooperation with the West, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. So, Germany were considering signing a deal with the Russians even a matter of months ago. So they can't sign the deal anymore, even if they wanted to, because there's no gas that can be transported through those pipelines, except what we'll call Nord Stream 2B. But the consequence of this is Germany still needed energy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was scratching around going, where do we get gas from? And bearing in mind, they'd already had this ridiculous energy policy. We're going for the green revolution. So let's get rid of coal-fired power stations. Let's get rid of nuclear power. Let's rely on wind and solar. And you're going, hang on a minute, you really thought this through. And of course, they already had problems prior to the Ukraine war. I talked about there being food and energy insecurity in Europe a couple of years ago, because you could see where this was going. Of course, all the Ukraine war did is exacerbate that multifold. So what happens is Europe, A, can't get the energy it wants. B, even when it does, they're paying 3, 4, 5 times what they would on if they just bought it from the Russians. And there's a sort of weird situation here where they didn't want the pipeline gas from Russia. But what they were doing is Russia was shipping via the sea LNG to China, and China was then making a profit on it and then selling it to the Europeans. I mean, this is how absolutely ludicrous this is. So Europe got Russian energy via the back door, but paid 3, 4, 5 times the price. I mean, this is absurd. But in doing this, what it did is it makes the industrial powerhouse of Germany, it can't manage to function. So businesses are going to the wall. They're having to mothball operations or reduce operations because the energy costs are totally prohibitive. So in the process, Europe's deindustrializing itself. And to make matters worse, and for the United States, is not only is it having to contend with all this sanctions boomerang, and it's affecting the US as well, not least because of the reputational damage from the global South's perspective, but also Europe's now sat there looking at the United States and going, hang on a minute, you made us put all these sanctions in place, but we're actually finding out that all this time you've been actually in receipt of Russian oil and in receipt of Russian fertilizer. In fact, in receipt of anything that you want to be in receipt of. You're trying to force us to actually sever all ties with Russian energy, and you actually want us to buy your LNG instead, which is costing us 3, 4, 5, 6 times the cost. And hang on, we're not very happy with this. Oh, and by the way, just to compound the problem, you introduce this Inflation Reduction Act, which is just massively subsidizing the green revolution, and to make US companies more competitive. Oh, but by the way, you're also seriously damaging European companies. The Germans and the French are furious about this, and saying you're effectively hollowing us out, and you have the temerity in the process to try and encourage all these European companies, such as in Germany, to go and relocate to the United States. It's not having a lot of success, but it doesn't matter whether it has success or not. It's the sentiment. So in the process, again, of the US deciding to adopt this policy, and because they just dug this political hole, and the political capital is so huge, because let's face it, after 9 months, if the Americans now walked away, and the Europeans, it would be political suicide, and it would have massive consequences for reputational damage, for the economies, for the political fallout. I mean, not just imagine the people in Western nations going, well, we've suffered all this cost of living crisis, which you have blamed on Putin, said it's his fault or Russia's fault, and now you're just giving up and going home. And so what happens to us? So they can't do this. They just have to keep digging a hole and saying, well, we just have to keep going, and we have to try and find more ways of sanctioning Russia, even though it's impossible. And we just have to keep fighting this proxy war, because that's what, when you expend that much insane political capital, you have no choice. But now Europe and elements within Europe, some political people in government and in opposition, you've got businesses and people, business institutes going, hang on a minute, we can't keep this going. It's not sustainable. They're also very frightened that public sentiment in Europe's waning, and that's true. It's not being reported in the West, but I wouldn't blow this out of proportion, but there has been protests in Germany, Austria, and places with people saying we've had enough of this. Mm-hmm. So they're worried that there's this groundswell of public opinion that's saying, we don't want this war anymore. And if that gets bigger and bigger and you have millions of people protesting, they're going to have a hard job justifying keeping the war going because, again, it's one of those situations. If popular opinion turns against the government to that extent, they're also worried there's a cost of living crisis. People are suffering enormously because they're struggling to pay their food bills because of inflation, their energy and interest rates are rising. Can they pay rent? Can they pay mortgages? They're really struggling. So they're going, hang on, we could have a serious societal meltdown on our hands. So they're very worried about that, which is why they're desperate to keep the idea from the West perspective. Look, Ukraine's winning. Everything's fine. Don't worry. If we just give Ukraine these arms, this is another game changer. How many game changers have we heard? And in reality, haven't been a game changer. So we're kind of in this situation now where even from the war's perspective, you've got in the military, you have people in the US military going, we need a negotiated settlement with this war. We cannot continue fighting it. You've got the people in the Beltway, in Senate and Congress going, no, we have to keep the war. We have to keep fighting this war. We have to defeat Russia. And then you've got NATO, where I think Stoltenberg basically came out and has effectively said today, well, Ukraine will be allowed to join NATO when the war ends, meaning, well, Ukraine's going to win the war and then we'll let them join NATO. I mean, this is highly provocative because from the Russians' perspective, they're going, we don't want you to ever join NATO. So this is just going to mean any opportunity to have a peace agreement, which ultimately in some capacity will have to happen, is just been thrown out the window. So there are many of these unintended consequences that are happening domestically, internationally. So it becomes an economic problem, say in Germany and other European nations. It's a financial problem because of all this inflation. And then at the worst possible time in this economic financial cycle, you've got the European Central Bank, for argument's sake, going, well, we need to raise interest rates. And the Fed's going, we need to raise interest rates. And we know that it's totally unsustainable because the entire West depends on endless cheap credit. Hang on. We haven't got endless cheap credit anymore, and we're suffering structural inflation problems. How are we going to combat those? And if it's in energy, then producer price inflation is a serious problem. And consequently, everything costs more. So there are all those factors. Then you have the geopolitical factor. And now you're starting to see Europe getting a bit sort of angsty with the United States about the things we've just discussed. And then you've got the global South going, well, Russia, China, you warned us about this. You said the Americans could do this. You warned that we could face serious problems if we oppose the United States. Well, maybe this could happen to us. So it kind of just accelerated this ongoing birth of multipolarity and nations like Saudi rotating more and more east, and Turkey the same. And the list goes on in terms of all these developments and how the global South's going, well, you warned us, now we're seeing it in reality. So we want to trade less and less in the dollar. We want to join other institutions and we want to protect ourselves and we want to be allowed to develop our own resources. And that's the big thing. The West has relatively little resources. It's saturated in debt. It's saturated in terms of consumption. We've got nowhere to go anymore. And the global South has all the vertical growth markets. It's very cheap to produce goods there. They have collectively access to massive amounts of resources, not just energy, but all commodities they need. And if they pool the resources and work together, they can function very nicely without the need for the West. And this is something the West thinks that China's totally dependent on exporting goods to the West, not realizing that those markets are actually ironically still growing. But the biggest growth sector is the Asian nations in Asia. Why? Because that's where, at the moment, this kind of center of multipolarity is. But bring Africa on in the coming years, and we've increasingly seen more and more of Central and South America coming on board, the Middle East. And all of a sudden, you're looking at this body of nations who can, A, function very nicely without the West. In fact, once they're out the SWIFT system and they're not part of the dollar, it's going to be very difficult for the United States to threaten them in any way. And also, they have the capability in the future to form massive trade alliances and work together and in win-win cooperation. People say that's never happening, but it is happening. We're seeing it every day of every week of every month. And the West still isn't grasping that this is a reality. And of course, whenever someone talks about trading in non-dollar terms, people just scoff at it and go, that could never happen. Mm-hmm. Well, it already is happening. And they need to start to actually deal with the reality of what's going on instead of just going, well, Russia can't do this. And Russia has an enormous resource base, not just in energy terms. And whether people believe it or not probably 4 or 5 years ago, Medvedev came out at the time, who obviously was the president and the prime minister at one point, and went, in relatively short order, Russia will not depend on hydrocarbons for its economy. And no one paid any attention because they went, no, that can't be a reality. But Russia's economy isn't dependent on hydrocarbons. Far from it. I think it's about 70% of its economy. This confuses people because nobody in the West understands what actually goes on in Russia. And it's the same with China. They think, well, China only produces cheap goods and it has to sell them to the West. It doesn't do anything else. Well, actually, no, it does a lot of other things because for the last 5 years, it's been going through this dual circulation, which means it's rotating its economy. So it wants to still sell goods to the West, but it's now trying to get more involved in the technology side. And it's beginning to lead in certain sectors of technology, even though everyone in the West thinks China steals all the technology, which, yes, at one time it did. Now it doesn't. And also by rotating its economy, this dual circulation, it's going to become more of a consumption market. And the people want high-end goods. They want better quality goods. So they'll get better quality goods. And China's changing its economy and it continues to invest abroad. So here's the irony. It can go and invest money in the global south somewhere. It can own companies that produces goods that then sells to the Chinese market. So it's win-win for it. Mm-hmm. It's a win-win for the countries they put these companies into operation there. So the world or the West has been completely asleep while all this is going on. And it's public knowledge. I mean, I've discussed this for years, but I said things 5, 6, 7 years ago, and people went, "You're insane. This is never going to happen." And here we are today. It's all happening. Now, it wasn't because I made it up or I was just took a wild stab in the dark. I knew what was going to happen. Right? 10 years ago, people told me this is the future. This is what's going to happen. And at the time I went, these are monumental paradigm shift. I went, that's exactly it, because the rest of the world was realizing the West was completely unsustainable from a financial system perspective. Mm-hmm. Their economies were unsustainable. Everything, it just, at some point, the wheels had fallen off. And 2008 was a massive warning about this. We didn't heed it then, and we've not heeded it since. And the consequences are, as a result of that, is that now things are happening and people are going, no, it still can't be free. But they don't realize how developed this multipolar world is, the Belt and Road and all these trade alliances. They're quite mature. And if people think they've kind of reached a peak and it's all over and multipolarity is dead before it's alive, this has got 50 to 100 years growth in it. And there's big long-term plans. I mean, the Chinese are famous for having 50-year plans. And mm-hmm. other nations are thinking, in 5-year plans, 10-year plans. And the difference is they have a political system, and it's not whether you agree with it or disagree with it, but in the West, we have a political system that's, apart from being a complete illusion, is completely useless to actually make any fundamental changes. Because someone's in the US for maybe 4 years, and if you get turned over in the midterms, you've got a lame duck president and a government or a Congress that completely works against you. So nothing actually fundamentally changes. We're in China. They have long-term plans and they stick to them. And if you look at what they say in every 5-year plan, and there's 100 points in it, after 5 years, they've achieved all those objectives. We can't do that in the West because we're impossible, because we're all fighting with each other and pretending the Republicans are better than the Democrats and vice versa, or in the UK, Labour's better than the Conservatives and vice versa, and not realising this is a complete illusion. It's a total waste of time. This political system is not designed to achieve any objectives. It's just to make you believe in this illusion of democracy, because you get to vote someone in and out every 4 or 5 years. But actually, what are they achieving? Nothing. And that's the big difference in the global South. They actually have plans and they're working to them and they're making huge strides forward. And imagine when you bring Africa on board. And yeah, there's a lot of problems we know in Africa, a lot of them created by the West, ironically. But if you look at how that as a pole alone, and it's already starting to make some quiet moves and talking about having an African currency for trading, when they're able to actually benefit from the massive resource base, the workforce, the demographic that's in their value. Now, if they can just sort out some of the problems they have politically, which a lot of it, of course, is a result of the West anyway, but if they can resolve those and start to work with the rest of the global South, the African continent is going to be a major pole in the future, and that's the whole basis. If we all work together, we could have South America as a major pole, Central America, Africa, the Middle East, Asia. Now, if these are all strong and vibrant in the future, where does the West fit into this? Because the West isn't going to be able to dominate anyone, because no one's going to be utilizing the dollar for international trade. They'll be using all these other currencies, bilaterally, trilaterally, multilaterally, in terms of obviously like the ASEAN, the RCEP, the Eurasian Economic Union, etc., etc. And therefore, the world's very different. And this is something the West has really not grasped yet, that it needs to get on board with multipolarity, rather than constantly trying to fight it and now trying to turn NATO against China and say we need to challenge China in the Indo-Pacific, as they call it, and try and get China to go to war with Taiwan and try and repeat what they did with Russia. I mean, this has to come to an end, because ultimately it's self-defeating. And really, the argument will be, when we get to the end of the war in Ukraine, whenever that is, and eventually there's going to have to be a peace agreement. Who knows how that will pan out? We can all have our theories on it, but sadly, I don't think Ukraine, as it was prior to the war, will ever exist as it did again. That's very unfortunate for a whole bunch of reasons. But the point is, there's going to be a time when Europe's then going to reflect upon this. And NATO's kind of telegraphing the fact, look, if we don't win this war, then it's the end of NATO. It's the end of the Western Empire. And therefore, I think the stomach for another war with China with respect to Taiwan, how many of NATO members are going to go, yeah, we agree with this? I mean, it's kind of like it's becoming a situation where it's untenable. And again, this is part of this boomerang effect. And the sad irony is, with regards to Ukraine, there was Minsk agreements, which would have given some autonomy to Donbass, which is Donetsk and Lugansk. And we could have, if they'd have been, they were written, they were UN approved, we would have never had to have this war. We would have never had all this loss of life and the huge displacement of Ukrainians. There's, probably ethnic Russians, 8 million have gone to Russia and millions have gone elsewhere in the world. And that's another point worth making, the kind of boomerang effect with this and the law of unintended consequences is that as Russia now is destroying all the infrastructure, which is a statement of fact, it's not something we agree with, but it's just reality. Mm-hmm. The risk is, imagine if they destroyed all the infrastructure in Kiev and 3 million people, which is the population of Kiev, were displaced from the city. The rest of the country can't take them because they're suffering the same consequences. Where do these 3 million people go? Because Europe can't take them. They don't have the capacity to take them because they've got their own problems. because of the consequences, not just of the Ukraine war, but that's a serious component of this, but also because of policies to do with COVID and stupid policies to do with the green energy revolution. There are many factors to it. But no one in Europe ever thought about this. But I think suddenly there is some cause for concern with the odd person who's in the European Union in a position of responsibility going, hang on a minute, we could have a refugee crisis, because it might not just be Kiev. It could be Lvov, it could be other major cities. We could be talking 10 million people, 5 million, who knows, but we're talking huge amounts. People being displaced. Where do they go?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, what does that mean in reality if there's nowhere for them to go? And they've literally got no energy. There may be serious problems in terms of people being able to get food. Never mind the fact of water supply, etc. Well, in essence, there's an argument if it gets that critical and Europe can't take people, the war would have to end. It would be the end of the war, because you couldn't continue trying to prosecute a war with that many people in destitution. And people may say I'm exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating. These are real situations that could now transpire.
Well, and if you add that many people as well and combine that with food shortages and energy shortages, that just compounds the problem again.
Yeah, enormously. And this is why, the sad fact is that this is very obvious, because to anyone, okay, I've spent a lot of time, and I deal with economics, finance, but I've looked at geopolitics for years. Because for me, we're always going to get to a point where everything's intertwined. We can't in the West just go, well, let's just look at what's happening in economics and finance and not actually consider, hang on, what's happening in the global South? What is China, Russia doing? What is the Asian nations doing? What's going on in the Middle East? Because they're all inextricably intertwined now, and we have to take the broader picture. But for me, and I'm not unique in this, you just looked at this from the outset, and I went, okay. And I spent 10 minutes and went, right, if the West throws the kitchen sink at Russia, if it succeeds, what does that mean? And this is a perspective the West didn't think about either. They think Putin's this hard line. He's not. There is a lot more people in Russia. If they were the president, they would have no problem whatsoever just destroying, flattening the whole of Ukraine, and wouldn't give a thought about it. Mm-hmm. There's far more hardliners. He, in comparison, is pretty soft. And people in the West go, I can't believe this, but this again is the miscalculation in the reality. So that's one aspect. Also, if you crush and destroy, and from their perspective, a nation, a nuclear superpower, as it were, which is a bit of a hideous word, but people know what it means. What do they think the consequences might have been if the West caused that? Do we run the risk of a nuclear war, World War III? Well, it's a possibility. It is unlikely as people might like to feel it is. That was a risk. So again, no consideration of that side. And then I flipped it over and went, well, hang on. What's the one thing Europe needs? Cheap energy. It's not going to get cheap energy from Russia anymore. It's dead and buried. Ultimately, this is going to be a cascading effect. Okay, we're repeating ourselves, but I'm trying to make this point that nobody in the West saw this. Forget the politicians. They don't see anything. They're not in the job they are to see and be great visionaries and thinkers. They're just there to repeat something. But none of their advisors. Nobody who had any earshot of these Western nations appeared to have grasped the gravity of the problem, although it's interesting we say that, because again, the world's not black and white, and sometimes nations will go, hang on a minute, this is a serious problem. Mm-hmm. But you never hear about it. But Johnson, obviously, who's the ex-UK Prime Minister, came out and made this statement that, well, the Germans came out prior to the start of the war and went, well, actually, it might be better for all of us if Ukraine falls quickly because of the economic damage. So on some level, somebody in Germany went, hang on, this is a problem. And the Italians apparently were very concerned because of their dependency on energy. So there was some consideration, but ultimately, despite those reservations, political pressure being what it is from Washington went, well, don't worry about that. It'll all work out somehow. This war will be over quickly, and then Russia will be begging to sell us cheap energy. We can buy it cheaper, and we'll get rid of Putin, who's the problem in Russia, and Russia will become all westernized. And then once we've got them in the fold, multipolarity is dead because China will cave in and collapse, because without Russia, China can't function in a multipolar world. They made all these assumptions, and that's why I'm a bit savage on Twitter about this, but I talk about all these Western Chinese and Western Russian experts who don't have a clue what's going on in Russia. They don't understand the Russian Chinese economy, the financial system, their societies. They don't understand anything about these countries. And this permeates from this mindset of people, institutes who policymakers and think tanks, and they all generally think the same. And they all imagine that China and Russia are these nations. They're not. And this is just then snowballs into this completely appalling misjudgment of the situation. And also when it's fueled by people, particularly in the US, but there's some degree of this in the UK and in Europe, of this absolute ideological hatred of Russia. And sometimes it's because of things that happened during the Cold War era, during the Soviet era, or it might be predating that. It might be to do with things that happened in World War II. And it's so ingrained that they're just fixated that we have to destroy Russia. And even if we burn Rome and the whole of Europe and the West, it's a price worth paying, without actually realizing there comes a point, an inflection point, where if you destroy the West, then it's going to be in no position to do anything to Russia. And it's the old sort of consequences. Ultimately, if you so ideologically driven, you destroy your own empire. I mean, it was in terminal decline anyway. Let's not sort of delude ourselves to that. But you're accelerating that and antagonizing nations in the process in the global south, and now antagonizing your own allies. And in fact, within your allies, there's disagreements now as to how we prosecute the war. There's disagreements inside the United States between the military and politicians. There's people in business going, hang on a minute, we need to rethink how we're fighting this war. Do we really want this war to continue? So the West's kind of eating itself alive in the process. And we've talked for a long time about this, but do you know what? This is very high level stuff. I mean, about an hour or so? And I haven't scratched into all the detail and all the nuances. And, I always come back to this point. The world is incredibly complicated. It's very, very convoluted. And just to give you an example of this, someone said to me 2010, and I was kind of aware of this anyway. And they said, look, it might surprise you, but you go to bed in the evening and you wake up in the morning. And the reason the world's pretty much in the same shape, you wouldn't believe what goes on to make sure that happens. And I went, okay, well, I'm taking this on board. Can you give an example? And they went, well, let's just pick an example. And this is even going on now, despite the fact the US is fighting a proxy war with Russia effectively and wants to crush Russia. There are still a perfectly set out process of these are the red lines. Russia has red lines. The Americans have red lines. And we're not going to cross those. Okay, is that all understood? Yes. And then Russia might pick up the phone to the US and go, look, we have some credible information that there might be a terror threat in the United States. We're just letting you know because we don't want it to happen. Okay, fine, thanks very much. So there's that going on the one side, whilst they're both technically fighting a war against each other on the other side. That's how the world operates. It's not all this black and white idea that relations are between the nations are so bad that the Russians would allow that to happen, or the Americans would allow it to happen in Russia. Because if these things happen, there are consequences. And the consequences, as we've just pointed out in the last hour, what the unintended consequences could be, you have to be extremely careful of, if you don't act on something, what might happen, or if you do act on it, what the consequences will be. And that's why the US has been very, very clear all the way along. We are never going to be seen to be fighting directly with you. Yeah, we might provide arms. We may have, volunteers from the United States. There may be some NATO forces in there, but you understand what they're there for, and we understand. So we haven't crossed the red line, have we, Russia? No, we haven't crossed the red line. And we're not going to give Ukraine weapons that means they could launch missile strikes on Russian cities, because that's a red line. Okay, no, we're not going to do that. And thus far, they've gone, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to give them these arms. The Ukrainians want them, and the Americans go, it's not happening. And this is the reality, and why I always made this point. The world's incredibly complicated. It's convoluted. There are so many angles to all these developments in the world, and we need to move away from this very black and white idea that this means that, and this is the consequence, and to have the idea that everyone in the United States is on the same page with the war. They're absolutely not. Mm-hmm. And certainly in Europe, they're not. There's very many different opinions. There's some who think the war should never end until you've crushed Russia out of existence. And if necessary, we'll have World War III. I mean, hang on. Are they serious? But yes, they're serious. You have other ones who go, well, we need to fight the war within the constraints. We can fight the war. But bear in mind, we don't cross these red lines. And then you've got others who are going, this war has to end yesterday because, we can't continue this.
Mm-hmm. I think a good example of exactly what you're talking about was when there were those 2 missile strikes in Ukraine. And, thankfully in that situation, cooler heads seemed to prevail. But that could have been a perfect example of if people were reacting just from a knee-jerk manner, how quickly and badly things could have gotten before it was really known where those missiles came from, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, here's what happens. I presume you meant Poland. I think you said Ukraine, but anyway.
Right.
So what happens is, this happens. So the Western media comes out going, it's Russia. And then you get all these people all over social media going, that's going to be World War III. And I'm going, no, it's never going to be World War III. Hang on, just take a breath, watch what happens. And within a couple of hours, the State Department and the Pentagon going, there is no need for escalation. Because they picked up the phone to the Russians, and the Russians went, look, it's nothing to do with us. And the Americans gone, okay, fine. Mm-hmm. If it was going to be a serious escalation, this is a red line. If a stray missile lands, 2 people were killed, and that's hugely regrettable because there's someone's son, daughter, mother, father, whatever. And all death is highly regrettable. But in the context of an escalation, it's never an escalation because it's obviously a mistake. Now, obviously, it turned out, of course, unsurprisingly, it had nothing to do with the Russians. And it was a Ukrainian stray missile. And there's all these conspiracy stories, and frankly, it's boring and irrelevant, and we're not going to deal in entertainment. But the more important point is the Americans and the Russians immediately understood the reality. Where the red line would have been, if Russia, for some inexplicable reason, totally lost its mind and decided to start launching missile strikes on a Polish city, then that's Article 5. Even though it's Article 5 doesn't mean it's World War III, because bear in mind, if we go to World War III, that's the war to end all wars. So you have to be very careful even then. But that would be the only scenario we'd go to Article 5, which is, you attack one NATO member, then you're at war with all of us, including the United States. Now, there is no way the Russians are ever going to launch preemptive strike on a Polish city. So again, this is just understanding the reality of how the world operates. So everyone's screaming, everyone's going, it's World War III, it's the end of the world, all this thing. And I've sat there going, it's not going to happen. This is not reality. This is reality. And surprise, surprise, this is how the world operates and functions. Again, you have to have back channels. what would be very disturbing for whether you're Russian, Ukrainian, British, Canadian, American, whoever, is if those back channel conversations stopped in totality. Now, there was a time when there seemed to be an admission from both the Russians and the US that the line went cold. That is a big problem because then the risk of miscalculation, which could have catastrophic consequences and can radically sort of increase the risk of that happening in multifold way, in many different ways. And you sat there going, hang on, we need to be extremely careful when the line goes cold. But the line isn't cold. Okay, there's people thinking there's some plan to end the war being cooked up between the Russians and the Americans. That's not true either. But they're at least talking. And they're going, we need to avoid crossing the red line so we don't have World War III. Because here's the thing, as much as the Americans want to try and win this war, because they, for all the reasons we've discussed, they're not going to go to the status of World War III to win a war for Ukraine against Russia. That is not a price they're prepared to take, or a price they're prepared to pay, because who knows what the consequences. I mean, at best, you've got mutually assured destruction, and this is not a popular thing to say in the West, but Russia's military capability should concern people. They, again, don't believe this is reality, but the American military knows that Russia has hypersonic missiles that the West doesn't have. So, hence why we just don't want to go have a confrontation with Russia directly. Of course, this, therefore, is something, these nuances that people in the West don't understand. But it's an important point to make that the complexity of things, and we could start digging in, and we're not going to because we'll be here for the next 2 months or something. But there's a whole level of complexity and things going on inside Europe, going on inside the US, going on inside Russia and the global South, and how this is all pulling together. But what we've just done, and it's taken us over an hour just to go through not a 30,000 foot view, maybe a 10,000 foot view. But if you want to go lower and start drilling into things, then there's a whole level of, again, complexity and understanding that we need to have to be able to make, I think, informed decisions as to what's going on, rather than relying on mainstream media and, dare I say it, lots of alt media, which too much of it's just entertainment because people like the intrigue and the mystery and the feeling that this might be happening and that might be happening. But at times, and we should be grateful for this, a lot of the things in the world are quite boring and mundane. And to be honest, it'd be nice for us to have a few decades of boring and mundane across the world, because we could all do with a break from all the problems we're experiencing now and things we've seen all over the world since World War II, ironically.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.